to stand up tall and proud. I want you to speak up clear and loud. Brown baby.
In a world overrun with the fake, delusional, and disingenuous, he stands as a beacon of truth. He is Abuki Cabal. You are listening to Abuki Cabal.
Welcome to the Abuki Cabal Show.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the show. If you could take a moment to like, share, and subscribe if you like the content, and we'll get on with the show. Today, I want to talk about Pauli Murray. I'm sorry. BGS has already covered her somewhat. I was hoping I could beat him to it. That rarely ever happens due to work and whatnot. But still, it's a worthy topic to cover. Not very many people know very much about Pauli Murray. Oh, I keep saying Murphy. Sorry. She was an extraordinary woman, troubled also, but she was very instrumental in fighting for civil rights legislation, and contributed quite a bit to civil rights, to efforts to stem the tide of sex discrimination, all of that. And we'll get into all of that. But as I did my research on Pauli, I found that different groups are trying to pull from her experience and her writings and everything that she left behind to further their own agendas. Pauli was gay, and basically she thought that she was really a man. She thought she had undescended testicles and whatnot. She had her troubles with that, which led to depression and other mental health diagnoses. From her struggle with her gender identity. Some think that led into a lot of how she thought about things. Her writings on what she coined, the phrase that she coined, Jane Crow, and the experience of Black women from racism. that term came from her experience in law school at Howard University, and her experience with black men, not with white men, but with black men. And that was because she felt that they were discriminating against her because of her sex. And I think it was a little bit more than that, due to the limitations of what a woman could do, and her being the first female law student. Even though she was very capable, there was not much that she could do with it during that time because of the sexual discrimination. Some of the instances that the instance in particular that she described about not being invited to a smoker that all of the male law students were invited to. Smokers were not things that women were involved with during that time. So a male social gathering, she was not invited to, and she felt that was discriminatory. I don't particularly see it that way. I'm sure that there was sexual discrimination during that time. However, there are just some things that women were not doing at that time. But we can see during today's times that women are out, smoking cigars and, pretty much wherever we are, they are. Even though we used to have, male spaces. Now more and more you see, as a result of Pauli's efforts, that a lot of those male spaces have been eradicated for the sake of inclusivity and what they deemed as equality. Although we see that as a result of that, it's not equality anymore. It's pretty much those spaces have been overrun and eradicated. We see this in gyms. We see this in, all manner of social places where men could exclusively go and not necessarily be around women. So my question, I had a question to BGS. Did he think that Pauli knew that there would possibly be, or had given any forethought to there being any potential damage to black men and the black community as a result of efforts to further women's rights? Because, in my view of after reading and researching a lot of what she did, it seems like she was just pushing for a universal women's rights, without regard to whether they were black women or white women. She just thought that by giving women the same rights as men, that I guess the other situations that were unique to the black community would, I guess, just melt away. And we still see some of that today. But as you'll see, after she also was a founder of NOW, National Organization for Women. And she eventually left that organization because the white members of NOW did not honor the positions or give any kind of exposure to the unique situations and concerns of black women. So there she found the same situation that she was in at Howard when she was in law school. When she was amongst white women, those white women discriminated against those black women in order to gain some superior position in order for their agendas to be at the forefront of any policies that would come forth as a result of the political movement that was pushing for social change for women. So again, women were left outside of that. You know, there's a documentary called on Netflix called "Feminism: What Were We Thinking?" and it exposes some of the very tactics that they used when the Puerto Rican women and black women tried to get up and speak during those the press conferences and during the meetings. They would cut the mic off because they thought that if the people heard some of the situations that were unique to black folks and brown folks, but we know Puerto Ricans are black too, that basically it would kill the movement. So Pauli eventually ended up leaving that organization. That led into intersectionality. And it kind of looks like this, where, Pauli influenced Kimberly Crenshaw into forming the theory about intersectionality. And in this view, they think that gender, race, class, nationality, sexual orientation, and abilities, all these things come into play with the discriminatory act that takes place against the person in question. So I would argue that the person who was discriminating didn't really look at all of this. Just being black was just enough. That was enough for you to be lynched. In Pauli's documentary, she said at one time, I think it was like 60 men or so were lynched a week. I think she said in the documentary. If you can imagine that many men, being killed, over the course of months and years, and I think, and that is being somehow relegated to something that was not as serious as, as equality amongst the sexes, when black men were dying in droves during that time, I think is extraordinary. So they go even further than that with intersectionality, and then they start adding even more stuff to it. It becomes even more scattered, and I think this is indicative to how, when we think about problems, we narrow the field as far as trying to solve the problem. But it seems like when they think about problems, they add more things to it. They make the problem even more complex. They give it even more parts in order for it to be understood to the umpteenth power. And you see this with the even more things that are added to intersectionality: ability, mental health, race, fertility, gender identity, personality, age, nationality. You see all these things that are added, and it just convolutes, one's ability to narrow down what do we have to just to do to basically just solve this problem without trying to to, cover every possible angle that could be, a part of the process of why this person is being discriminated against. Look, if a person's going to discriminate against you, just one of these things is enough. They don't even have to take. I would dare say that they don't. And I've been in situations where I've been discriminated against, and I don't think that the person was sitting up going, well, I wonder about the occupation that he's in and the location and what's his physical health. All they cared about was that I was a black man, and they didn't want me around. If I was smart about something, then it was like, he thinks he knows it all, or whatever the case may be. Or if they just didn't want you there, they just didn't want you there. They didn't care what religion I was. Although I've been in a situation when I was in the military where, religion was a part of it, where I was told by a senior chief that there were no black Catholics. With regard to people going into church services that were being held, and telling his Catholic members that they weren't to associate with black folks who were not Catholic, so things like that, So, I think when we look at the sexual discrimination that took place, in these times, what we read about it, what she describes is more about you being black than it was about your sexual orientation. That could open you up to other things like, being essayed or things of that nature. But that did not remove that same threat from men. Men were being essayed as well. It was a complete and total violation of your person because of you being black during that time. During the time when Pauli Murray came up in college, in law school, etc. So I want to go into a little more about some of the other things that she did. Like I said, Pauli coined the term Jane Crow to describe intersecting forms of discrimination faced by black women. Jane Crow highlights how black women experience both racism and sexism simultaneously, as you can see by all of the bubbles. Okay. But all those bubbles and stuff, I think that's more of Kimberly Crenshaw's, but it was still, I think, Pauli's initial idea, which was basically the framework for intersectionality. All right, so Murray's concept of Jane Crow helped shed light on the unique challenges black women faced during the civil rights era. The term serves to draw attention to the specific ways in which black women are marginalized and oppressed in society. Okay, Murray worked on Jane Crow. Mary's work on Jane Crow continues to influence discussions on intersectionality and social justice today. But you see how this puts more of the forefront. No one talks about black men. All they talk about is black women and their marginalization and their place in society, but black men have been replaced. Although Pauli's efforts initially were because of a situation where she was discriminated against for sitting with her friend on the bus. And, there are some said that she was basically, masquerading as a boy or a man on the bus when she was riding with her friend. But that led to her trying to take legal action against separate but equal. So Plessy versus Ferguson. So, also, Title VII, of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Okay, so there are efforts right now by the LGBTQ community to add sexual orientation to this. I don't think anybody is speaking enough about the fact that every time they add something to this, it takes something away from the people that it was intended for, and that was Black people. All right. So while adding sex as a protected category under Title VII has generally been seen as a positive step forward in promoting equality and protecting individuals from discrimination, there may be specific instances where unintended consequences or challenges have arisen. In the context of Black men and boys, some argue that the intersectionality of race and gender discrimination can result in unique challenges that may not be adequately addressed by current legal frameworks. For example, there may be concerns that efforts to add sex-based discrimination could unintentionally overlook the specific experiences and forms of discrimination faced by Black men and boys. It is essential to acknowledge and address these intersectional issues to ensure that protections against discrimination effectively address the experiences of all individuals, including Black men and boys. Ongoing efforts to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion are crucial in creating a more just and equitable society for everyone. Okay? So that was something that I put together, and those were some thoughts that I had about it. And basically, you don't hear any of that. When they talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, they never talk about Black men and boys. It's always Black women, it's always white women, and it's always the gay community and the trans community. So we are being left out of the equation. And again, I ask the question, even as Dr. Murray became older, she had to have seen that her efforts for equality were not leading to equality or equity or anything in that direction. What it was leading to was an imbalance. If it was bad for men to be in a superiority situation as far as education, jobs, the legal precedent, all of that, then how is it going to be a good situation when the tables are turned and it becomes imbalanced to the point to where women are in a superior position over the men who have had nothing to do with any of the historical imbalances with regard to discrimination, sexual discrimination, and the things that they have been taught about in these women's studies programs and on a day-to-day basis, which have caused them to treat men in some of the most some of the rudest ways, and we're being characterized as being useless. There's no need for us to exist, and men never said that. In any point, at any point in history, did men say anything like what women are saying about men today and about Black men? And it's despicable. And for it to be coming from the halls of higher education, and people who basically champion Pauli Murphy's efforts is questionable at best. So we're going to take a look at a few things that I gathered up for us to look at. This is the National Organization of Women, and it has a page dedicated to Dr. Murray and her efforts, and it gives a breakdown of everything that she did. Talks about her when she was African-American civil rights activist who was arrested for refusing to move to the back of the bus at Petersburg, Virginia, 15 years before Rosa Parks. So she was a trailblazer. That was the incident that I was talking about earlier. And she organized restaurant sit-ins in Washington, D.C. 20 years before Greensboro sit-in. She was one of the most important thinkers and legal scholars of the 20th century, serving as a bridge between the civil rights and women's rights movements. She was also a member of NOW. They don't go into why she left, but she was very vocal about why she left. She was the top of her class in law school at Howard, which won her a seat for doctoral studies at Yale, but because she was a woman, she was denied. I have another article here, which is pretty long, probably too long for us to cover here, but it covers the murdering of crows. Her articles concerning Jane Crow and the racial struggle. She says here in this part where she said she had entered law school preoccupied with the racial struggle, but I graduated an unabashed feminist as well. Ironically, my efforts to become a more proficient advocate in the first struggle led directly into the second through an unanticipated chain of events which began in the late fall of my senior year. Okay, and it goes on to say where for admissions to Harvard Law School, in Rebels in Law, Voices in History, Black Women Lawyers, noting that Murray was denied admission to Harvard Law School because she was a functionally normal woman, even though her rank as first in her graduate class would have otherwise garnered her admission to Harvard. Okay, so that's one of those. But what I think we'll cover more of the basis is I'm going to play this. And we'll talk about it.
Thesis that was to prove perhaps the most pivotal senior thesis that anyone had written to that point. In it, she argued against the NAACP that it would be better to fight against segregation as a direct violation of the 14th Amendment. Now, at the time, civil rights lawyers like Thurgood Marshall were arguing, had accepted, or at least were willing to follow as a precedent, the Supreme Court's decision in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which ruled that the states could set up separate facilities, be they trains or buses or schools, so long as the institutions set aside for African Americans were equal in funding and quality to those established for whites. And Murray said, equality is never going to be achieved this way. it's necessary to argue that segregation places a badge of inferiority on Black people, although she said Negroes, and that the only way to remove that badge was to remove segregation. She was in a class with Spotswood Robinson, who despaired of Pauli's being way too radical. He argued that this was an argument that was never going to fly before the Supreme Court, and he bet her $10 that the court would not see her way of reasoning for 25 years. But in fact, Pauli was able to persuade both Robinson and Thurgood Marshall of the merits of her approach. And Thurgood Marshall won the case of Brown versus Board of Education using Pauli Murray's argument in only 10 years, in 1954. The argument was already developing in her head that if this argument would work in civil rights, it ought to work also in women's rights. And in 1962, she got a chance to advance this claim when Eleanor Roosevelt, who had become a close friend over the years, appointed her to John F. Kennedy's Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. And Eleanor Roosevelt asked Murray to see if she could resolve a disagreement among feminists that had been becoming worse and worse over the last 40 years.
So you'll see here that basically Eleanor Roosevelt was who became friends with Pauli Murray through correspondence. She had been peppering the president with letters about why he didn't stand up for civil rights and for the condition of Black people during that time. And as you can see, during this time, she was heavily into trying to better the condition of Black people through civil rights victories and challenges to current law. She also went on to catalog every Jim Crow law in every state in order for the NAACP to make legal challenges against these laws. She did that, with very little pay. No recognition. As you can see, Thurgood Marshall used her arguments, but she did not get any credit for any of this. But she was at the forefront of thinking that was far ahead of her time. Even though she was young, she was a radical thinker. But also, I think what is really important about this is the beginning of other organizations using the victories of the civil rights movement to further other movements like feminism. And then after that, the same strategies are being used to further the LGBTQ communities, strategy to gain more legal representation and legal power, and it's to our detriment. I mean, everybody thinks that it's a great thing, but as I said again in my initial question, what forethought is being given to any unforeseen consequences of this chipping away at the Civil Rights Bill? For everybody else, for people of color, for sexual orientation, gender confusion, all of these other things, and it's as a result of this woman's work. And also, she was a part of that as well, because she was confused. She was influenced by doctors during that time who were doing experimentation on gender and altering gender and things of that nature, you know, and now we have other problems that we're dealing with right now. And it's like people say that, oh, because we're putting one person, well, you know, one group up, you know, it doesn't take away from the other group. That is not true. That is not true. Because they don't send money in all directions. You know, money is funneled off into the thing that the important thing of the day, and they are getting all of the airtime. No one is talking about men and boys. No one is talking about the drops in men in education, in higher education, and the potential damage that could do to our society at large. So let's move on with this. There's some good stuff in here.
And that was the disagreement between the National Women's Party and, of course, Alice Paul, which was fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment. Alice Paul had written the first version of the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923 and had been pressing for its passage in Congress for 40 years. And today it's hard to look back at that time and to see why Paul was having so much difficulty winning support for an amendment that to most of us seems like the most obvious thing in the world. But there was another branch of feminism that looked on equal rights as too extreme and as something that in amendment form could challenge what many women leaders viewed as one of the most important achievements they'd made in their lifetime, which was the passage of protective labor laws in states across the country. It's important to remember that this was a time when women were exploited terribly in businesses around the country. And protective labor laws were passed in order to ensure that women didn't have to work past a certain number of hours and that they would have a minimum wage. And they were worried that if the Equal Rights Amendment passed, that these protective labor laws would be struck down. And poor women in particular would be out of luck. Murray created a bridge. She was poor. She had worked in the 1930s in the most menial of positions. She understood what it was to be exploited by race and by gender. But she was also a lawyer, and she believed strongly in equal rights. And she saw a parallel between equal rights being demanded by civil rights leaders and the equal rights being demanded by women leaders. And this is what she did to try to bring the two sides of the women's movement together. She spoke to the Women's Party and said, you're forgetting how difficult it is to pass an amendment. I mean, you've been trying for 40 years, right? Without much success. And part of that is the structure of American politics. You have to persuade supermajorities of male-dominated legislatures in 38 states of this country to get an amendment passed. That's not likely to happen in our lifetime. Much better to adopt the same approach that has proved successful with the Supreme Court. Show the analogy between the discrimination based on race and the discrimination based on sex, and use the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to grant rights to women. The success of that argument was shown in the President's Commission on the Status of Women in the final report, which accepted Murray's argument and set the ERA aside for the time being as a goal. Alice Paul and other members of the National Women's Party were understandably furious, but there wasn't much that they could do except to find another goal. And they found one immediately in a civil rights bill before Congress that had been languishing for some years because Southern Democrats, very conservative and opposed to equal rights racially, kept those bills bottled up in committee, or if they ever got out of committee, filibustered them to death on the Senate floor. But Alice Paul thought that the time might have come. John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963, and at that time, the civil rights movement had its best chance of winning legislation. Lyndon Baines Johnson became president and was in favor of passing a civil rights act that protected African Americans from voting discrimination, that ended segregation in public facilities, and if possible, brought equal employment rights as well. And Alice Paul, and really, since she was getting on in years, her lieutenants were the ones who pressed this in Congress. The original bill only addressed voting rights and public accommodations, but civil rights leaders pressed for the inclusion of what was called Title VII to prevent discrimination on the grounds of race.
Now, this is very important, and she's gonna tell you some very important information about Title VII and why sex was added, and just listen closely.
Employment. And that's what Alice Paul saw as the target that should be turned to by the National Women's Party in order to gain protection for women, at least in the area of private employment, if not against state discrimination. They proceeded with what I think was a Machiavellian move. They talked to Howard Smith, who in the House of Representatives, he was the Virginia representative who was the head of the House Rules Committee. And they told him that if this law passed, then it would protect black men, but that it was going to exclude white women, and that it was outrageous that this should be done. And therefore, they should support, Howard Smith should support, and Congress should support the inclusion of sex as another category of illegal discrimination under Title VII. Well,
see that? See how white women were up in arms about black men gaining protection, even though they had been discriminated against in the most horrible ways imaginable for years, hundreds of years. Far worse than what women had endured during that time. And rather than having a separate form of legislation specifically for women, they forced the inclusion of sex into Title VII, which ultimately we know historically was detrimental to black people, all black people, black women and black men.
Howard Smith thought that this was a brilliant idea because best case scenario, adding sex to Title VII would lead to the failure of the Civil Rights Act to pass at all. But even if it did pass, it would be popular among employers because most employers didn't like protective labor laws for women because it ate into their profit margins. Because they could only hire women for a certain number of hours, they had to pay them a minimum wage. If protective labor laws fell because of Title VII's inclusion of sex, that meant that they would have a much freer hand in hiring and in.
So, see, with the passage of Title VII, business owners won. They didn't have to protect. The protections that women had were gone. They were erased. But in these feminist studies now, they always bring up that women were not protected, women had no rights, nothing was good for women. but it was guaranteed that those women would have time off, that those women would get their 8 hours, their work hours, whether they worked them all or not. You heard her just say that. But then those protections were going to go away with Title VII. So with that victory that they got with Title VII that they fought for, they lost something too. So, and black folks, we already know what we lost. And we lost that because they didn't really want to give us anything anyway. So white women were pretty much in league with the white senator who really just didn't want Title VII to fail in the first place. So here we go.
And deciding what to pay women workers. This point was not lost on Democrats in Congress. The act did pass, the Civil Rights Bill did pass the House and went to the Senate, where Everett Dirksen, who was a Democrat from Illinois, immediately struck sex for the very reasons that Howard Smith liked the idea of the inclusion of sex. And at that point, Pauli Murray sat down and she wrote a memo. And the memo made the case that in order for civil rights to be complete, it had to include women as well as men, and it had to include them specifically by outlawing discrimination in private employment, not only on the basis of race, but on the basis of sex as well. And she eventually, with the help of other women's rights leaders, made the case. Dirksen put sex back in Title VII. With a lot of trouble, the bill did pass the House and the Senate, and Lyndon Baines Johnson signed it in July of 1964. In fact, July 4th, 1964. The next year, Pauli Murray, with the help of a friend, Mary Eastwood, published an article called Jane Crow and the Law, which was basically her memo to Congress for passage of Title VII. And that article became one of the most influential law journal articles that has ever been published. For the next several years, Murray, through the EEOC, where she met Sonia Pressman Fuentes, who I hope is here with us today, and through efforts at the federal court level, she tried to make the 14th Amendment strategy work for women. But again and again, efforts fail until, and if you could get the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, I meant to have this before. This is Pauli Murray with Eleanor Roosevelt in 1962, shortly before Eleanor Roosevelt's death. Something that Murray took very hard, in fact, dedicated her work on the President's Commission on the Status of Women to Eleanor Roosevelt. The next slide, please. Here she is with Pauli Murray's on the left, Esther Peterson of the President's Commission on the Status of Women is on the right. Next slide. Here is a young Ruth Bader Ginsburg who read Pauli Murray's law review article, Jane Crow and the Law, and saw in it the possibility for going to the Supreme Court and winning a case under the 14th Amendment. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg did that in 1971 in a case called Reed v. Reed in Idaho, which had a law that barred women from serving as executors of estates. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg was able to argue successfully before the Supreme Court that this was an arbitrary law. And for the first time, the Supreme Court ruled that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment applied to gender discrimination. That accomplishment would have been enough for most people. But Pauli Murray, who was by then a tenured professor.
Okay, so that's enough of that. So as you can see, she influenced a lot of people, and a lot of people, a lot of people's careers were made so much better because of the efforts of Pauli Murray. Pauli Murray's work. So all of this reading that people did, and then people basically just followed her framework and had legal wins with the Supreme Court, and policy was enacted. Okay, so we see all of this, and you can't help but think that there was a lot of faith in the benevolence of white women once they, gained more political power, that they would be good to us, I guess. So I think I have this in the right place. Let me see. And yes, this is the New York Historical Society that is talking about Pauli Murray's the documentary, and basically you'll have each faction. You have this young lady here. She is a doctor, a historian, feminist, who is speaking on the feminist point of view. This black lady here is also a feminist, and this guy here is a part of the LGBTQ community, and all of them are talking about, the portions that they took to benefit their different factions from Pauli's work. And some of them are going back and renaming Pauli's pronouns and whatnot. The lady who is basically organizing the panel here, she does a good job at keeping them on task. Let me see if it's in the right place here.
That is crazy making, and that that mental illness is massive.
Hang on, let's go back.
For all of those limits, I just got tears in my eyes.
So when the court can so gay about it, but like the way that
discriminated on the basis of gender, RBG's life's work. But I think the reason that it was important to the women's rights movement.
And so, as folks were thinking about it in this moment, the civil rights cases that we'll hear in the 50s of feminism,
Black women's intellectual history, the history of the civil rights movement.
Things that are blacked out in some of the letters to people. And I was mainly curious, so I don't know that we had too many things that we were like, we really want to so playful, and all these photos of them together, and Pauli was in
too, and the kind of the records of that being in the film, I thought was really
emerge from such a difficult, challenging background. So that was our thought.
Yeah, and I was really struck by the kind of, in RBG, people really connected with the love story between RBG and Marty, and that for all of the suffering that was involved in Pauli Murray's life, there was a lot of love.
Yeah.
And romantic relationships too, and the kind of the records of that being in the film, I thought was amazing to have that, and especially because, and I want to talk to you about this, Talea, because as you're going deep into the archives here, there were things that Pauli wrote in Pauli's autobiographies, and then there were things that were left out that you could find in the archive. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what that process of research was, what some of the discoveries were.
Sure. I mean, we were so fortunate that Pauli left all of those records. Going into this, as Betsy was saying, we were really hoping to paint a full picture of a person. It's very easy to paint a portrait of a person who seems like they belong on a pedestal, and we can definitely put Pauli on a pedestal, but Pauli in so many ways is actually very relatable. And we really wanted to humanize Pauli as much as possible. And so going into the archives, I will say I've spent a lot of time going through lots of people's archival records, and for people like Pauli, you can end up finding like a lot of drafts of speeches and various versions of legal briefs and things along those lines. And having read Pauli's autobiography and having spoken to people who knew Pauli My concern was sort of like, well, how personal can we actually make this film? Because Pauli was incredibly private. So it was such a joy to go into the archives and see that Pauli actually left not just letters to people like Nixon, but also letters to people like Aunt Pauline and various friends, and also had responses from those people, and diary entries, I mean, covering decades. And the letters, as you mentioned, Pauli had the heartbreak from an early relationship with a friend named Peggy, but then also had such a strong connection later in life with a woman, Renee Barlow, who became really a life partner for Pauli. And I will say for us, that was one of the last stories we crafted. With the relationship with Peggy, there are all these photos of them together and writings, and so we knew how we could tell that story. And with Renee Barlow, we weren't quite sure how we would paint a portrait of that connection, because there are like 2 photos of Renee.
Now, here you'll see where the people who put together the documentary wanted to give you a portrayal of what their interpretation of Pauli's letters and everything that she left behind. She was a very private person, but they wanted desperately to get into her sexuality, her personability, her likability, all of these things, because her accomplishments weren't enough for them. They had to get into the salacious stuff. They always have to get into that, because women like drama. So and for furthering the modern agendas that are going on right now, everything is about sex and sexuality and gender, and that's exactly what they wanted. They wanted all of that, even though the majority of the time the time that Pauli spent was not in that direction. But being black is never enough, it would seem. So that's kind of what you will see with this, the characterizations that they wanted to portray and what they wanted you to get from Pauli. It's not good enough for you to interpret things yourself. They have to spin it for you. So here we go.
And really nothing else. And so my very last trip to Schlesinger Library, right before COVID shut everything down, I basically went and pulled every folder with Renee's name on it and ended up finding that exchange of letters between the 2 of them. And they're so intimate and so personal and so delightful, right? I mean, I will say one thing that was fun to discover is like how...
See, she had to get into the relationship with the women. She had to find out what was going on with Renee, Renee Barlow. So, and that's inconsequential to her accomplishments, really. But they had to tell that part of it because to them that's important. That's the important thing today to push is the gay, and that's unfortunate.
Funny Pauli is, which is like even comes through in the letters that that you've been reading. It's like Pauli had such a sense of humor and was so playful, and that's also a thing that I hadn't expected. Thinking, I always say, reading about Pauli, when I first started to learn about Pauli, I felt like I'd be very intimidated to actually have to meet this person and interact with them. And so it was a delight to actually discover, oh, Pauli actually seems really cool, like a person you can hang out with and have a good time. Yeah. And so it was fun to actually feel like we were discovering Pauli through, and like the full breadth of Pauli through the records that Pauli left.
I love that, and I think that really comes alive in the film. I think we're really lucky that Pauli left behind that archive. At the same time, weren't there things that were ripped out that were not in there? Like, what did you not find that you wanted to find?
Well, I don't know that there was. I was mainly curious, so I don't know that we had too many things that we were like, we really want to see X, and we're not seeing that. I was much more like, what did Pauli leave for us? And so it was really just looking through the archives to see what was there. But one of the questions we had was, because Pauli was so private, when we started, some people had voiced a concern of like, well, what would Pauli want people to know about Pauli's personal life? And reading through the archives, the more time I spent there, the more we could see that the archive is actually highly curated. That everything we're seeing is...
See? She left what she wanted you to talk about. And the extra digging was what you wanted to try to find out. You know, you'll hear, like I said, you'll hear more about this of the guiding, you know, the hand holding of what they want you to get, you know, from this. They're pointing, and this is important, this is important, this is important, and not what you skim through and think is important. They want you to focus on the thing that they want you to focus on, and that is what we're seeing more and more today in these women's studies and all of that. Like I said, it's not enough for you to be black. You know, you got to be black, a woman, and, you know, an alphabet member in order for things to matter.
Something that Pauli left for us, and you can tell because in the diaries and in the letters, there are like some pages ripped out of the diaries, for example. There are names that are blacked out in some of the letters to people, and so it's very clear that Pauli is sharing exactly what Pauli wants to share.
I find that amazing and wonderful, because I think it's clear that while the world did not always recognize that what Pauli was doing was history making, Pauli understood that, right? Pauli was very self-consciously creating an archive here. Brittany, you've written about Pauli in the context of Black women's intellectual history, the history of the civil rights movement. I'm wondering if you could, you know, you mentioned Thurgood Marshall. There's a really interesting story about Pauli, and it's more Spotswood Robinson, but also involves Thurgood Marshall and the kind of intellectual parentage of ideas. Can you help us understand how Pauli was shaped by that history and what Pauli did to kind of change that history?
Yeah. So, you know, Pauli, you know, this sort of tension between the archive and the storytelling and who Pauli actually was is a really interesting tension. So there's a way that if you read Pauli's two autobiographies, Pauli presents herself or themselves in those books as a kind of respectable race.
You hear that? Presents herself or themself. So she's adding pronouns when Pauli never used pronouns. Pauli never referred to herself as anything other than she. And she stopped with she once she went to seminary school, and then she wanted to be called Dr. Murray. Okay, so you have this recharacterization of this historical figure in a way that she did not want to be characterized, but they're going to try to justify that by saying, well, she didn't have those terms available yet, but if she was here when those terms were being used, then she would embrace the they them. Well, you don't know that, because Pauli didn't like the term black. She liked a Negro, because they fought so hard for the term Negro to be acknowledged as something other than derogatory legally. So I find this distasteful.
This woman, civil rights activist, lawyer who is really documenting a life, and in that way really positions themselves in this long history of Black women, of Black feminism, of feminism more generally. And then you go into the archive, right, and you learn about the lovers, you learn about the sort of gender expansive way that Pauli understood themselves long before we had terms like gender expansive, right, or trans, right, or queer, but none of that shows up in the autobiography. And so one of the challenges, you know, particularly in this moment that I think is really important to address forthrightly, is when I, for instance, as a Black feminist scholar, say that I understand Pauli Murray within this long tradition of Black women's intellectual history. How do we do that as historians and thinkers, and also really affirm Pauli's gender identity as one that, you know, that defied history? that was ahead of its time in many ways.
So you see they're trying to add things to the story that Pauli didn't necessarily add to the story. There's definitely an agenda by these folks who are in these women's studies, feminist historian studies. Even though Pauli didn't say this and didn't say that, how can we say it so that we can acknowledge her being post-mortem? And it's just this is ridiculous. And I think it does a disservice to history. When teaching history, you are to teach history. You are not supposed to characterize history in the flavor that you want to characterize it. You tell the history as it was. And this is just, I mean, especially for someone who considers himself to be a scholar, I think this is troubling,
But one of the ways Pauli Murray helped me with that, right? Because in some ways what happens is that Pauli goes to Howard and is at Howard in the 1940s as Howard University Law School is on the cutting edge of many of the civil rights cases that we'll hear in the 50s and 60s. And the thing that I say about that experience is that it is at Howard that Pauli gets disciplined into this positionality as a Black woman, right? Has really resisted that in much of their life and in much of their relationships, but sees the sexism that is so blatant among these very respectable race men types, and starts critiquing it forthrightly and saying, oh, we don't just have a problem with Jim Crow, we have a problem with Jane Crow, and y'all are excluding me because I am a woman, right? I also imagine they're excluding her because they're homophobic and because Pauli is masculine presenting.
See the adding that goes, none of that was even talked about at all in that. Never mind that the way social order was set up was in a way that men were in the positions that Pauli was trying to get into. Just because you're interested in something, if it's filled with men and has always been filled with men, then when you go in there and you're a woman, you're going to stand out. It'd be no different than if a Black person was trying to be the first Black person in the Klan. How successful would that venture be? And you're essentially trying to force your way into an all men's club. And now you're adding all of this, gender non-conforming and all of this other stuff to it that these people, we have no evidence that these people even considered any of that.
And can be a bit aggressive in the way that they sort of show up and challenge people. And there is no space or grammar for that in respectable Negro life of the 1940s, right? And so...
I know you're on a roll here, but I just want to say, I think that's also explicit, that Pauli was not allowed to be a plaintiff because of not modeling the kind of respectable Black women.
So when Pauli and her friend Adeline McBean take over this bus in 1940, right, part of the reason that the NAACP will not take this as an early case to challenge segregation is because they get written about as a heterosexual couple because Pauli is masculine presenting on the bus and gives Pauli's name as Oliver. And so basically the NAACP...
So see, she has jumped from when she was in law school, and she's jumped all the way back before she even went to college. Okay? And now she's talking about that. And this instance that nobody was even considering when she was in law school. So we're jumping huge time pieces here.
Avoids this and says this is a gender scandal, we don't know what to do with this kind of queer Black life, and so they just avoid it altogether. Meanwhile, Pauli then comes to Howard a year later and blows everybody out of the water, becomes the top-ranked woman in the class, and top-ranked person in the class. Only one woman in the class. Top-ranked. There were two women, one drops out. Pauli's the only woman in the class, top-ranked person in the class, writes a senior thesis saying that we should overturn Plessy v. Ferguson out of hand, which is not the strategy of the NAACP at that point. And that paper, which is 10 years ahead of its time, becomes the basis of the legal theory for the Brown case that makes Thurgood Marshall so famous. But again, all of that is against the backdrop. So it really feels...
She's hopping all over the place, and this is chaos right here. But when you see the documentary, My Name is Pauli Murray, you will see that none of that she talked about was even in the documentary. When she was riding with her friend, they didn't even talk about any of her presenting as a male and that being a scandal or any of that. But they'll go off into that, how she met with Thurgood Marshall, and they were impressed with her. She wrote up, her and her friend wrote up the entire incident in a way that was so professional that they said that she did it as well as any lawyer. Okay, and it was written up like a legal brief. Okay, but she's adding all this other stuff into it that I don't know if she got this from the archive, but it wasn't in. And I looked at several different depictions of her life, and none of them talked about any of that. So I don't know if she's privy to information that we're not privy to, but she's adding things to the story that were not in the documentary, and this is supposed to be about the documentary.
It's important to say this and to make it clear for our audience, right, that there is this tension. And so Pauli Murray will talk about themselves as a woman in particular moments.
As you see, she talks about herself as a woman, but she's calling her a them.
Largely because the dictates of history don't make it possible for them to be legible in other ways, right? And
so Pauli was such a smart person that she was able to express herself from the time that she was a child, saying that she didn't want to wear dresses and things like that. But she wasn't smart enough to coin a term for how she felt that she was. This is disingenuous. Pauli had an entire folder full of her efforts to identify what she felt was a medical condition that was nothing. She felt like she was a man, but she wasn't a man. Like I said, a lot of stuff that we see today, she was looking for medical interventions from anybody who was doing work on anything that sounded promising to her, even to the point of wanting to undergo exploratory surgery to find testicles that were not there. So that could be, for those of us in the medical community, that could be questionable behavior. She had constant bouts of depression and things like that, probably because of how she felt. And it goes into some of that. But clearly this black lady is adding to the story for the sake of pandering to the LGBTQ community and at times, black feminist communities, and I saw no evidence of that in the documentary, and I suggest that you guys look at it.
So, as folks were thinking about it in this moment, we both want to understand them in that history of black female activism and intellectual production that is actively suppressed by black men, and also recognize with the benefit of this moment.
And see, here's the villainy that they want to cover black men with. Like black men were out just oppressing black women who were trying to do things, and that it was not the system that they worked in, that they had to live in as well. I mean, the rules were not set by black people. Howard University was funded by the government, by white people. Okay, if they did not run it the way they saw fit, they would shut it down. So they don't see it that way. They just see it as black men, these upstanding, stiff-shirted black men who were basically just waiting to oppress the black women who had so much to give to the civil rights fight and and basically they were just relegated to mopping floors, and that was not the way it was. That was not the way it was. And through Pauli's description of what happened, the incident that happened that made her, question, that was not what took place. And that came out of her own mouth. And she talks about it in the documentary. So, here we go.
That it is also Black cisgender people suppressing trans folks, right? And their intellectual production too.
And she made no mention of anyone, discriminating against her based on any kind of gender situation at all. And they say this because she didn't know how to word it. Pauli was not the type of person who was had a lack of ability to orate or to describe anything that was happening to her and to formulate a plan to fight against it. So this is disingenuous, and this is people who are basically trying to further this new thinking, this nuanced thinking, and I hate that word because it reeks of just the chaos that they are trying to institute.
I think you make a case really persuasively in your writing on Pauli that, in fact, it's that experience that draws Pauli, in addition to working in the civil rights movement and doing that intellectual work and the theorizing, that, by the way, I'm pretty sure Pauli didn't know about it until much later. Right. They dug up Pauli's old paper, draws Pauli into what was then known as the women's rights movement.
That's right.
And this is where the second encounter between Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Pauli Murray happens. And Pauli begins to theorize about how to find constitutional equality in the existing, bunch of dead trees. And so, I have so many questions for all of you, but I want to make sure we get to the 14th Amendment work because it is what part of RBG's life's work. But I think the reason that it was important to put Pauli Murray and Dorothy Kenyon, another ACLU attorney, a radical lawyer, on the cover of the Reed v. Reed brief, which we mentioned before, just to spell it out, Reed v. Reed was RBG's first brief to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that win was the first time that the Supreme Court had found a law that discriminated on the basis of gender unconstitutional. I'm going to stop talking because I am not a lawyer and I am not going to talk about this as brilliantly as Chase. So Chase, tell me about, we're going to talk more about what Brittany said about that tension, about how to read Pauli. But for now, I wonder if you could just help me understand the intellectual work that Pauli did with respect to the 14th Amendment and what that means in the broader context of the law.
Yeah, it feels so rich and special to be sort of holding Pauli in this space. And I just want to say, and then I'll talk about the Constitution, the way we're talking about Pauli. So Pauli's birthday is November 20th. Pauli is such a Scorpio. Like this whole, not to be so gay about it, but the way that Pauli...
See, not to be so gay about it, but it is gay, and all the women are just so happy to bring the gay into it because her accomplishments are not enough. We have to bring her sexual orientation into it and who she's having sex with. That is paramount in who these people are, but it's so distasteful when it comes down to what they term as cisgendered people. But for them, we've got to know who they're having sex with. That's what this is coming down to. Legal precedent based off of who they want to have sex with.
Is both curating a narrative and being so incredibly private at the same time, and thinking about Pauli in this way. It's just, there's so much to say, and there's so many ways to relate to Pauli, and Pauli's sort of intellectual rigor around thinking about the Constitution, and now, in 2021, we sort of take for granted that the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, prohibit sex discrimination. But of course, it is not spelled out in the Constitution, and this is why many people for many years up to this day were advocating for the Equal Rights Amendment, and that, you know, what we have in the 14th Amendment is a prohibition on treating similarly situated people differently. But it's very recent that we build this robust body of law around sex discrimination, and obviously it's grounded in the work that established the constitutional prohibitions on race discrimination, which are spelled out more explicitly in the 14th Amendment.
See what I'm saying? See how they used our gains as the framework for them to walk up our backs and take all of the monetary remedies that were supposed to come to us, and they're basically being funneled off to white women and to gay folks. And some of it, a very little bit of it, is going to black women, and black women are championing more of it being divvied off to these other groups and these of colors and all these other people, while black men go starving for attention for their needs, educational, occupational, and family-oriented needs. And in the meantime, the black community is in shambles, while more black girl magic, more LGBTQ magic, and more white woman magic. That's what this is being turned into. You know, a celebration of Pauli's efforts in giving them the keys to the city in order to challenge everything based on the 14th Amendment.
And so when you have sort of the way in which Pauli's, and I think this is really important, that Pauli informs the Brown strategy to not focus on showing that separation was fundamentally, or that the separation itself wasn't in practice equal, but that it was inherently unequal. And so this idea, too, about challenging notions of sort of formal equality and looking at anti-subordination principles, which we have had a harder time doing in the sex discrimination context, as we see in the present with all of the, you know, sort of discrimination against trans people and questions about, well, what is sex separation and can it ever be equal?
And you see how sex is being used for sexual orientation. See how it's being stretched to cover their sexual orientation to mean the same as something that is as solid as sex, you know, and how they're making everything non-binary, but the actual word sex is supposed to cover men and women. You know, whatever other capacity that you may exist in, it still falls under the binary constants of male and female.
But Pauli sort of bringing these anti-subordination principles into the legal doctrine and informing the development of Brown v. Board of Education and the equal protection jurisprudence around race, and then transferring that along with RBG and others into this body of law around sex discrimination, and not just, you know, the courts striking down laws that discriminate on the basis of sex, but establishing what we understand to be the heightened scrutiny that sex-based classifications get under the law, and that becomes the basis for a whole body of case law that strikes down laws that differentiate on the basis of sex, and ultimately culminating as well in the 2020 decision in Bostock, which of course is not a constitutional decision but a statutory one, finding that laws that federal statutes that prohibit sex.
Just 1 second, because for the non-lawyers, constitutional and statutory, let's talk about specifically what statute are we talking about, and why is Pauli significant when it comes to that statute?
Yeah, so right, we have, the Constitution has the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause, and then we also have, federal statutes, so federal laws passed by Congress, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibit, among other things, discrimination on the basis of sex in employment, as well as through amendments in other parts of federal law, education, housing, credit, healthcare, and so when the court considered in 2020 whether the Civil Rights Act's prohibition on sex discrimination included a prohibition on discrimination against LGBTQ people, ultimately the court ruled that it did. But in order to get them there, one of the things that we had to sort of convince them of, at least atmospherically, if not doctrinally, was that there were LGBTQ people in the world at various points, including in 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was passed.
And why was that pertinent to the discrimination that was on the table about black men being lynched, skinned, burned alive, all of these things? They didn't discriminate against those people based on sexuality. They discriminated against those people based on them being black people, them being Negroes. And you guys have jumped in, and then you further desecrate the Civil Rights Amendment by jumping in on it and saying that you are somehow the same. And it is not. I'm just astounded that more black people are not offended by them not having their own form of legislation that is unique to sexual orientation and not sex, as in male and female, but sexual orientation, who you having sex with, who you want to represent yourself as, what kind of that's a whole nother decision in itself. And I think the court was wrong in the decision that they chose. It is the law of the land now, but I think it was a stretch, and it is to the detriment of the black people who bled and died for this legislation to be passed for the protection of black people. And you heard why sex was added. Sex was not added as something good. It was added as something that would be detrimental to both women and to the black people who were trying to pass that legislation. So, this person's views, he's elated based on his own self-centered position with regard to his sexual orientation. But it has nothing to do with us.
And so if you think about Pauli as an advocate, sort of developing law and analysis, and of course, legal advocacy works through analogy. That's just how it works. And so Pauli was one of the people that was taking each step, pushing it, and then using what came of that to build the next step. And so when in the late, in the 2019, 2020, we're back at the Supreme Court arguing to the justices, including RBG, who's still alive at the time, that federal laws that prohibit sex discrimination protect LGBTQ people. We're taking Pauli's work and building that next step. And going all the way back to, Pauli's experiences at Howard and the thinking that Pauli had done around race and building out the constitutional doctrine, which is then transferred into the statutory analysis, so the interpretation of Congress's laws as they apply to us, not just when it's the government acting, because the Constitution is protecting us against discrimination by the government. But these statutes are protecting us against discrimination by private actors. And then we are then unable to build this next step without all of the steps that Pauli and others built for us. And so there is no set of legal protections that we take for granted today without all of the foundational work that Pauli did. And I want to just quickly say that when we think about Justice Marshall and Justice Ginsburg and Pauli, these were all people who were litigating over their own existence in one way or another. And so not only, were they themselves thinking about as an advocacy matter, sort of what is a legible legal, what is a legible legal subject? What is a woman? What is a Black woman? What is a Black heterosexual woman? What is a Black queer woman? All of these boxes is what the law demands. So they're crafting legible subjects for purposes of argument. But of course, that's influencing and reifying their own possibilities for themselves too, going back to what Brittany said. And so I think all of these icons of civil rights litigation, including Pauli, were constrained by what they could present to the court and made compromises that impacted not just all of us.
And you see the strategy for the boxes and disassembling, what the boxes contain, the parameters by which we define, the person that we are dealing with in whatever, legislation that we're dealing with. You see, their strategy is just laid bare, and they attribute all of this to Pauli, so then, when we say that Black women support things that are not beneficial for the Black community, I can't help but say, this is probably one of those things. She started out trying to help the Black community and took it in another direction and started helping white women to basically dismantle our benefit, and continued even after, you'll see in the documentary where some of the students even said that she was out of step with some of what she was doing when she was when they were protesting, and she was against their protests. And some of the students went and went to her home and got to know her even better, and they talk about their experiences knowing her outside of being of the campus and whatnot. That's when you start getting into some of these other things. But it makes me wonder where the conversations did take place, where these things are happening to us, and how do you feel about these things? And I wonder if some of these things are in that archive, because they're talking about what they want to talk about out of that archive. That archive, you'll see it, and it is enormous. These aren't just a few papers. This archive is gigantic. Her books, her papers, all of her writings from the time that she was in law school all the way up to seminary school. So I am very interested to see if there was an evolution beyond this surface level benefit, self-benefiting, agenda affirming picture that they're painting for us.
But their own possibilities for existence. And I think that's one of the real limitations of law and legal advocacy.
I have to say, though, for all of those limits, I just got tears in my eyes when you were talking about the through line between Pauli and the Bostock decision in 2020, which RBG was allowed to vote that because of sex did extend to LGBTQ individuals. But I want to spend the remainder of our time talking about, even though I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface of...
I'm going to stop here for just a second, because, Ruth Bader Ginsburg did vote on that 2020 decision, and then you see how she, by thinking about Pauli's position and thinking about, her own benefit from Pauli's thinking, and then making the stretch. And I'm sure in the in chambers discussions with the other judges, she probably pushed to add, this beneficial ruling to those folks based on, her reverence for Pauli and whatnot. I don't know. I don't know how to feel about that. I feel like she was prejudiced to some degree in order to make the stretch to add this extra provision over something that was clearly not sex.
Pauli's life and intellectual work. I do want to spend the balance of our time talking about the tension that Brittany identified, which is how do we talk about Pauli Murray in a way that takes into account the constraints, perhaps, that Chase mentioned, but that also respect our conversations and understandings of today, or perhaps maybe things that people didn't know about Pauli at the time that Pauli left behind in the archive, as Talea said. So Chase, I'm going to come back to you. So you talk about how Pauli is in the position of being forced to litigate Pauli's very existence. But even that, there was a limited view at the time, or maybe a limited vocabulary, maybe not, because there's all these letters where Pauli asks doctors for a gender transition. How do you understand how we can talk about Pauli now? I've been following what you told me, which I was persuaded by, which is using the name Pauli instead of a gender pronoun, because we know that Pauli chose that name, having been given a different name. How do you, and it's not just about pronouns, right? It's also about identity and connections with movements.
See how they're pushing this in there? You know, this is someplace that they didn't have to go, but they're forcing this in there, and the documentary doesn't even cover this very much at all, because Pauli didn't really emphasize that as much as they wanted her to emphasize it. And you see that you know, the moderator is saying that how do we respect, you know, how people want to talk about it today, and how people want to categorize, you know, people's gender, you know, the they, thems, and the pronouns and all of that, and at the same time respect the way that Pauli actually, you know, categorized herself, or how she actually lived her life during that time, you know. And we don't know anything about it, but how can we just add something to it to try to wonder how she thought about it when she was living her life, even though we were not from that time. See, so this is some weird stuff that you'll see these learned people engaging in.
How would you suggest that we understand Pauli? You know, given that at times Pauli called themselves the Negro woman, was part of the women's movement, and yet there was so much more to Pauli's identity.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's for me, it's about entry point and exploration, because Pauli's not here to tell us. And so everything we impose upon Pauli, whether it's, you know, Pauli is this identity or this identity, is we're bringing our own assumptions to the table, and we aren't there. And Pauli was operating with so many constraints, and left behind some of what Pauli wanted us to know, and we also just don't know. So for me, it's about holding that complexity. Like we simply don't know what Pauli would have wanted. I think it's also about challenging assumptions about the sort of historical realities for people. Like, you know, we hear a lot, well, there were no trans people at that time. Well, there.
No. Everybody knows that there were trans people around. It's just that there were social norms that were adhered to. You know, if you were that way, you did what you did in the dark and not in public. And that was to keep people out of your business. But for some reason now, you know, everybody has to wear their sexuality on their sleeve, because this is what the new folks want. And this also brings into question, why is it that the black lady up in the corner there, you know, felt the need to they, them, when she, like the gentleman says down here at the bottom, we don't know. We're just adding to this, and we shouldn't be adding anything to the story. You know, do you see where I'm coming from? Where it's so disingenuous to add to the story. That's not your place to add to the story. You're just supposed to tell the story as the evidence is laid out. You discuss it. She laid the story out for you to tell. So for you to put your spin on it is just not correct.
Were trans people at that time, and there were also trans people receiving medical care at that time. That's partly, you know, and there all of these histories, and the language is different, but we also shouldn't say that.
And the medical care that he's talking about, that medical care was at times unsanctioned. It was unethical. They didn't know what they were doing. They were experimenting on trans people, and these people were so desperate that they were willing to allow these people to do all kinds of experimentation on them that was atrocious, which led up to Dr. John Money's experimentation and horrific experiments on the twins. So what they label as care is questionable at best.
These things didn't exist, and so I guess for me, it's all about just asking questions and knowing that that it just is a site of inquiry and exploration to say that Pauli was constrained by so many things, but let's explore the fact that Pauli did ask for hormones. That we know that to be true. Pauli did use the name Oliver. Pauli did choose the name Pauli. And so there were all these signifiers, regardless of how Pauli identified, that Pauli was facing a host of discrimination, types of discrimination for not comporting with sex stereotypes of that time and of the present. To me, it's all about like holding the complexity and messiness of Pauli's story, and that we can't easily categorize Pauli, and that's one of the reasons why we don't know about Pauli, because our construction of history is, and especially legal history, is so invested in categorization and binary. And so when someone defies that and complicates that, it's so much easier to write them out. And so those are the types of things I want to see happening, is for us to be asking the questions, well, what more can we learn? How much more can we build through Pauli's story when we simply can't go back and decide who Pauli was or how Pauli would identify? And so, I think it's to me, it's just this beautiful exploration. And the last thing I want to say too is there is this other aspect of things of Pauli's life too, where, Pauli really struggled with mental illness and severe, pain and trauma and mental health consequences of being in a world that simply did not hold Pauli. And that I think too, thinking about as people who do not fit into what society wants of us, that is crazy making. And that, that mental illness is mapped upon us based on our failures to conform. And that's a part of Pauli's story too that feels really important to draw forth and is very present in what we see. So I've been speaking way too much. I want to stop, but that's all I have to say is hold the mess.
I just jump in. I just want to add a little bit to what Chase said there that I think is really important. That I do think, what I've come to understand working on the story is I think one thing for people who are just now learning about Pauli Murray, it's important to understand that for so long, there's a tendency to just acknowledge Pauli Murray as a Black woman and to not really acknowledge the expansiveness of Pauli's identity. And so Chase talking about...
See, it's never enough to just be Black, to be a Black man, a Black woman. There has to be more to it. You got to be more, and that's the nuanced. It's, you've got to be more. You've got to be of color. You've got to have some extra, superpower in order for you to be relevant in today's circus that is the academy and the rearranging of history for the sake of acknowledging, how, these other marginalized people felt, because, how dare we address the people who were really, really living as subhumans and there just can't be focus on that. It has to be all these other people were suffering too. Well, I was suffering too. I was suffering as a white woman. I was suffering as a Black woman. I was suffering as a gay person masquerading as a mariachi. It's got to be something extra.
Really holding the messiness is sort of the point, right? That I don't know that we need to answer the questions about what are the categories that Pauli should belong to now, as much as we need to just actually acknowledge Pauli as a complete person. And that includes Pauli's gender identity. And for so long, that wasn't happening. And so the biggest thing is for us to do that now.
I love that. But Brittany, has the way that you teach Pauli's work and the way you draw out that intellectual history in your own work changed over time as your understanding has evolved?
Yeah, when I first learned about Pauli Murray, all that was being whispered in the early 2000s was, there were rumors that Pauli was queer, right? But none of...
So the only things that she heard was that Pauli was gay. She didn't hear anything about Pauli's accomplishments or anything like that. So she wants us to believe that no one was talking about her accomplishments. They were just talking about her sexuality. I'm just done. I'm kind of done with the assistance of Black women with the propping up of these new agendas that have nothing to do with us. I just don't understand why there is no effort for the betterment of the position of Black people anymore. I guess that's old news, and now we've moved on to everybody else's stuff, And I would be less. I'm less interested in Pauli's sexuality as I am with her efforts in trying to do something for her people. What she did for herself is secondary. It would be no different than anybody else. This is like talking about JFK having back issues. What if we put up, all of the people who suffered from back injuries during that time, we need to bring them up and lift them up right along with the president who had back injuries and who were injured, veterans and whatnot. And it just got to the point where it was so overshadowing of what was truly important about what we were talking about. And that's what this is. This is fluff and cloud. This is diversions as to the importance of Pauli's accomplishments.
That showed up in the book. And so this, the sort of notion that Pauli was trans or gender non-binary, that wasn't even a part of the conversation when I was writing a dissertation, And so when I went to the archive, one of the things to say about that archive is Pauli deliberately leaves a folder with documented medical history of these struggles over a decade or so, asking for gender affirmation procedures, diary entries where they're struggling with how to identify why don't people see them as the gender identity through which they see themselves. And so Pauli left that.
And one of them was, you'll see that in the documentary, and you'll see the actual response of the doctor and how he apologized that he that he did not find what she thought was there. So even today, if a patient comes in with something that they feel like, oh, I've got an extra finger, and you don't see an extra finger, I mean, you're forced to tell them, I'm sorry, but there's nothing that I can do for a finger that's in your mind. You know what I mean? So this is pretty much the limitations of medical intervention during that time was not in her favor. Psychiatric medicine was not in her favor. She's lucky that she didn't wind up in a mental institution as a result of some of the things that she was asking for. But these people treated her with care and basically kept her out of those type of situations. I mean, people were enduring all kinds of things during that time: electroshock therapy, all kinds of atrocious medical interventions. But okay, there's a folder where Pauli talks about her sexual orientation. But again, in the scheme of things about Pauli, that's what you want to talk about. That's what you want to dig into. And, that's what I find questionable about, these female historians who want to find these things that are in the scheme of things not as important as the astounding work, groundbreaking work that she had. But at the same time, when you delve into these things, you have to also think about the implications of what if I win? How would this affect us? What will we gain? What will we lose? It's not enough to just win. You have to know, and you have to continue to make adjustments after your win. And that's something that I thought about. With every action brings about an equal and opposite reaction, and may require adjustments. In order for your intended result to still to remain beneficial. And as great as her mind was, I think she did not think enough after the wins.
That story for us to tell, I think, with the understanding that we would, as Black folks of the church would say, would understand it better by and by, right? And I think that is sort of the way that we honor Pauli's life, is by trying to tell the full story. So yes, I initially taught Pauli as a Black woman, and quite frankly, I still do, because I don't think that's incorrect. I just think it is correct that Pauli is more than a Black woman, right? Pauli is not only a Black woman. Pauli might not always want to be a Black woman or identify as that. And so how do we make space for the multiple truths that Pauli had to hold in Pauli's life, right? And so I try to do that with some care, and also with the understanding too that part of the challenge of this that we don't always say is when you see a person that helps you to understand so much about yourself in the way that Pauli does, right? And you recognize how indebted we are to Pauli, right? That there's no major movement of the 20th century, quite frankly, that Pauli is not a part of in some ways. Civil rights very early, right? Changing the nature of the church, changing the legal profession. Pauli Murray writes the first book of constitutional law for the country of Ghana right after independence, right? Pauli Murray writes the first compendium tracing racial laws in the United States. I mean, Pauli Murray writes a 1,300-page dissertation. Pauli Murray's an American Studies professor. Like, we haven't even touched the surface.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, all of that, and like I said, I mean, she goes even into it herself as, she teaches Pauli as a Black woman, and, that's not necessarily correct. I mean, not wrong, but she was also more than a Black woman and all of that. But, it's like... But I feel that all women are like this. It's like they have to get down and, got down into the, the gutter of a person's personality to try to, paint the picture that they want. And this is why reality TV is as tasty to their palate, as it is. I'm not gonna, go any longer than that. We've gone, oh my God, we've gone almost 2 hours. I hope that this is not too long. I hope you guys, enjoyed this. I will go ahead and end it there. But this is a pretty in-depth look at Pauli Murray and my thoughts and my take on her and how she's being characterized in history. I hope you guys enjoyed the show, and I guess we can discuss it in the comments, you guys' thoughts and what you think about my take on Pauli Murray. Thank you guys and have a good night.